Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer, and today we are talking about, again, the water, as they say, nothing but the water. We are dealing with one of the most critical issues of our time in the wake of climate change, but always perennially the right or the human right of clean, safe drinking water. And our guest today is none other than Professor John Cronin of the Pace University Center of Technology, Policy, and Environment at the, I believe it's called the Blue CoLab, right? Or is it Blue Ecolab?
Blue CoLab.
Blue CoLab. John, as I say, good morning, welcome, and thank you for agreeing to do this show.
So good to see you again.
We have to quit meeting like this, but again, it's I saw you at the recent conference held by the Hudson River Sloop Clearwater. Again, our intersectional work there on the Hudson River, but also Pete Seeger and the wonderful life work he did with regards to creating a movement and a revolution around action on clean water, but the Hudson River being that marker where, as I said, a blue marker where he drew the line in the sand. Listen, we got a lot to cover, and let's hit at the top. 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio catches fire. Where were you? But number one, but number two, was that the thing that got you into action, or was it Deep Purple's Smoke on the Water?
Well, in 1969, I was probably somewhere deep in an anti-war march. So that's where I cut my teeth, in the peace movement, and working for the Quakers and doing draft counseling for the poor boys who were being sent abroad for reasons they didn't understand.
Okay.
And but I'll tell you a really interesting irony, given what I ended up doing with my life, is that those of us who were involved in the far left in the late 60s, when Earth Day came around on 1970, we thought that the liberals were cooking it up as an excuse to distract from their failures on the war and civil rights. It was it's not remembered very much, but it was a very popular notion at the time. And I was amongst those who thought, oh yeah, look what you're cooking up here. You think we're going to let you get away with it. But the fact is that one of the reasons the environmental movement took off, from my point of view, looking back on the history, is if there hadn't been a civil rights movement and there hadn't been an anti-war movement, I don't think we would have had the mood in the country to turn out tens of millions of people on Earth Day. Those three things formed a tripod that changed America. But rooted in the civil rights movement, which was rooted in the immigrant-based labor movement. We're part of a long tradition there. So when the Cuyahoga River fire came along, it was more a symbol than anything else, because here's the dirty truth about the Cuyahoga River fire. When it caught, when the fire started, it lasted. I wrote a whole article about this. It lasted for 15 minutes. And nobody got down there in time to film it or shoot it. And the photographs that you see is the Cuyahoga River catching fire in the 1950s.
Really?
And
so
but it became
this was a almost a perennial event.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it became a big symbol. And what really drove people, though, if you go back and look at the headlines, was the Santa Barbara oil spill.
Okay.
So the idea of the oil spill, then the idea of a river catching fire, that just pardon the expression, really inflamed people. And the images, the imagery was everything, because we were seeing marches in the South. We were seeing people being killed in the field in Vietnam. So the environmental movement to launch needed its own imagery, and the Cuyahoga River and the oil spill in Santa Barbara and the thousands of birds that were contaminated, those became symbols that lasted for weeks and weeks.
And it's within that window, 69, 68, again, what they call the fire in the streets, the death of Dr. King, the death of Bobby Kennedy
Absolutely.
Jr., the radical. I mean, things were really at a fever pitch. And Nixon basically ran on the covenant of law and order. And so the reaction in the environmental movement was absolutely to take the tactics and direct action strategy of the civil rights and the anti-war movement to elevate the Earth crisis or the Earth Day, and centering even a message on that, saying how not only are we failing domestically within our civil society and democracy, but even in how we've let corporations run amok and destroy our planet.
And an illustration of how inextricably linked the early environmental movement was to the civil rights movement is if you go back and you look at the speech that Senator Ed Muskie gave to 10,000 people in Philadelphia on the first Earth Day, 1970, and that Gaylord Nelson gave to his audience in Denver in 1970, it's an earth-shaking speech. I mean, they both of them said this is not just about clean water and clean air. This is about housing. It's about poverty. It's about hunger. It's about ghettos. It's about the disproportionate distribution of wealth. Those were Earth Day speeches in 1970. Right. So, fast forward to 2023, and you wonder, you look around and you say, boy, we got to give the environmental justice movement some more speed. And it was being said back in 1970.
Well, in that period, because one of the most powerful is say, what's the music? What was the score? And you had Marvin Gaye with The Message, right?
Mercy, Mercy Me.
And did that song not link it all together? Pollution, war, racism, failing civil society. And it was, when looking back, and in prepping for this show, I was just connecting certain dots. And I'm like, wow, this clearly was a watershed moment, but it also opened up a broader conversation of even the consciousness, even of young activists at that time, like yourself, who were pulling it all together. Because remember, the silent generation of the 50s and their team, as I say, the doo-wop, crowd, they were asleep. Your generation was the generation of action, of fire. And it was that direct action that really pushed Congress, and people tend to give Richard Nixon credit with the EPA and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, but they don't really point out the fact that, he was really reluctant and he wanted to try to resurrect the 1899 Refuse Act. And it was literally a legal battle between the president, who really wasn't that green, and the Congress of that time.
Yeah. Well, we in the modern era, we haven't had a green president, and I'll tell you what happened with I'll tell you what happened with Nixon. About 5 years ago, I interviewed his chief speechwriter, and if you go back and look at Nixon's first State of the Union address, which was in 1970, and you look at the headline of the New York Times, the front page headline of the New York Times that day, written by Robert Semple. That headline is, I'll paraphrase it, Nixon lays out an environmental action plan for the nation. 20% of his State of the Union address was about the environment, because his advisors and his speechwriter said to him, Gaylord Nelson's Earth Day is coming your way at 100 miles an hour. You've got to talk about the environment before he does, before those millions of people turn out in the street. Because it was clear, because of what happened because of the civil rights movement, because of the anti-war movement, it was abundantly clear that Earth Day was going to produce tens of millions of people, and Nixon was trying to get ahead of the curve. And that's what his speechwriter told me.
Well, and that's really awesome, because also, and he had a warning before, because the Republican Party, and he had missed the message when Martin Luther King was jailed. And it was Bobby Kennedy who got his brother John F. Kennedy to swoop in to get Martin Luther King out of that jail. But Nixon had that up because, people don't realize a lot of blacks were Republican, and they actually turned to the Republican Party, and they turned to Nixon to get, Martin Luther King out of jail. And it was his dragging of his feet that actually caused him not to make that happen, but also caused what I call an earthquake, within the civil rights movement, where blacks who from the Civil War on were mostly Republican. And it's interesting that he has that in his rearview mirror. The last time I failed in a major social movement, I lost the presidency. I lost the nation. And so it's kind of interesting. A new ecological revolution is coming on board, and that he had to act. He had to act. Listen, we got to get a commercial in here. We're going to come back at the top, and we will pick this up. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer, and our guest, Professor John Cronin of the Pace University Eat Blue Collab. And we are talking some of the deep history with regards to the environmental movement, but also just, again, the evolution of environmental policy and what it meant and its impact on our civil society. But more importantly, the power of grassroots direct action, how since the 60s, it has been a powerful transformer of our civil society and helping our civil society try to course correct on some of the errors, whether it's corporate, ecological, etc. But actors and leaders that like our honored guest, Professor Cronin, who were at ground zero when these things happened, but also at the shoreline, and as I say, and at the movement evolution line when it came to other actions, whether it's the EJ movement, which we will get into later on in the show. But I want to highlight and lift up the fact that, we went from that very powerful period of crisis and change in the 60s, but out of it came some of the most profound laws and legislation that did not come out of the center of Congress, but came out of grassroots movements that informed Congress, and that battle between the various parties that ended up giving us new laws and new action, as I say, and creating a new dialectic and new baseline by which new action would happen. And yes, I was in there coughing, but we'll get through that. But
you're getting yourself all worked up there, Aaron.
Oh, listen, brother. This stuff.
You're listening to your own gospel.
Listen, this is the passion, man. When I'm with brothers from the choir, brother, and we start ripping and going into this history, it brings back memories. It brings back the struggle. You never get old. The fire is always in you. But the pain in us having this conversation is looking at how far we still have to go, and how the other part of the dialectic is not so much that we wake up population and take action in our interests as a people, but how government and corporations learn from our action and then come up with new ways to resist and retard and degrade our rights, degrade our environment, and try to keep on keeping on and keep everything profitable at the destruction of our planet and ultimately our species. 1977, Clean Water Act happens. And tell me about where you were in the movement at 19. I know you were coming off of the resistance, the peace movement, resistance movement, but 1977, you now have, in the wake of this law, this action, the issue now becomes, how do we start to mobilize around this Clean Water Act? But also wanted to at the top, John, if you could tell us what the Clean Water Act of 1977 is and what it did for America and clean water.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, by 1977, I was deep inside of it. And the law was actually 72. So the law was 5 years old by the time I was deep inside of it. So the Clean Water Act, very simply, was supposed to end water pollution. I mean, it's hard to believe all these years later, but it was also to restore the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. That's the purpose. That's the quote from the purpose. And to do that, it had some goals that were both inspiring and alarming. So I will tell you that when I first went to work for Clearwater, Pete Seeger got me to volunteer, and then I ended up in the staff. So by 1977, the Clean Water Act was 5 years old, and I was deep inside of it. When I first got to the Clearwater office, though, we had a stack of copies of the law. The law was so new and exciting. They had distributed copies of it all over the nation.
Okay, pause real quick, because we want to pick up a very important piece of history, because this was at the point which Pete created the sloop Clearwater that ties together the arts, the music, the resistance. Because Pete, by the way, he wrote the score to the civil rights movement. People do not realize it was Pete Seeger that wrote "We Shall Overcome," and
he introduced that to Dr. King.
Yes, and a number of the other themes that people just take for granted. But here was an individual personified resistance, arts, action, direct action, labor. He's a labor activist, leader, civil rights, environmental, and he, right at this pivotal point in time, created the sloop Clearwater, because at that time, you pretty much could walk on the Hudson River.
Yeah. So let me tell you a quick story. I mean, the way I met Pete was that I was actually a roofer when I met Pete.
Really?
A roofer and a house painter. And I met Pete because I heard this boat called the Clearwater, which I knew nothing about, was going to sail into Beacon, New York with a load of pumpkins. It was October. And he was on board the boat. He pointed to the dock and he said, "I need people to help me come repair it." And I showed up the next Saturday. And then for a bunch of Saturdays, it was a group of us and Pete. And then for about 3 weekends, Pete and I were the only ones left. And he just worked on me. He said, if we all work together, we can clean up the Hudson River. And he used to, and he'd stand up and yodel at the mountain across the way. He was he was a political hero of mine. He wasn't a musical hero of mine, because of his work in the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and then the peace movement. And he basically cajoled me into volunteering for Clearwater, and that changed my entire life. I was just a city kid. I was a city kid from Yonkers, and the only reason the river was there was to separate us from New Jersey. So, I knew nothing. I knew nothing about the Hudson, but he got me to volunteer. And the first thing I did as a volunteer is I joined this project called the Pipe Watch, and the Clean Water Act was brand new. And we went out and started investigating these companies that supposedly had permits under the Clean Water Act, and found a whole bunch that didn't, including a tape company that had 26 pipes and only had a permit for 2. And that evidence we collected led to the first prosecution of the Clean Water Act in New York, Federal Clean Water Act in New York State.
Wow.
And you're absolutely right. The river, it was commonplace to see floating sewage, oil slicks, garbage along. You can find the old black and white footage, garbage along the shore. You used to stand in Beacon, and instead of looking across at the beautiful waterfront, there was a junkyard, and the junkyard was so high that it obscured the Washington Memorial, that General Washington Memorial, President Washington Memorial, that was up on the hill behind it. That's what the river was like back then. And certainly when I was growing up, we were told to stay away from the Hudson.
When I was growing up, because I grew up in a family of 9, my father was a labor rights organizer, and he goes back with Pete and them to the Paul Robeson Rides and Peekskill Rides days. And the reason why a lot of Black veterans were in Peekskill, which then was like Siberia, was because a guy by the name of Fred Trump would not give Black and Puerto Rican soldiers the GI Bill. So that's where a lot of Blacks went to Beacon, Newburgh, Fishkill, Peekskill. That's where that whole Black vet community came from. And Pete pretty much settled amongst these leaders and activists. And as you know, their efforts, along with a lot of the Blacks who came out of the South, fleeing the racism in the South, that became the hub. And there was the waterfront where a lot of these World War II vets, laborers, that's where they would fish. And a lot of their values, I grew up on the Hudson River front. I learned to fish and swim in the Hudson River. In fact, we used to do Frankie Avalon, beach blanket bingo, and we would take 2x6s from Creed Brothers Lumberyard and paddle out into the channel. And I'm gonna tell you, it makes me shiver to this day to think that I'm still alive given what we were doing. And I had yet learned to swim, but I was out there, and you would go out there, get caught in the current, and then drift down there past the Peekskill Marina.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but we did not know about the contamination, and I ate and consumed fish from the Hudson River right up until I went to college, and then I learned. I go, good God,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
and you know it to be true. A lot of people of color, subsistence fishermen and anglers, fished the Hudson, and regardless of what was floating by, and it was not
yeah.
a human health concern.
Absolutely, and people across the lower income brackets and people of color especially. My mother grew up in a poor family with 5 brothers, and her father fed the family from the Hudson River. Eels in the bathtub. I mean, that was that was just a part of her everyday life, and he taught her and the brothers how to skin them. And that's what they lived on, and the river was an integral part of their life. By my generation, it no longer was, at least down in Yonkers. We were taught to stay away from the river. So I carried that memory with me when Pete introduced me to the idea that you could actually fight to take the river back, and something that had never occurred to me, despite the fact that I already had quite a few years under my belt as an activist. And you mentioned the Peekskill riots, and Pete was very aware of the fact that he carried, if you will, the shadow of that with him wherever he went. And in the early days of Clearwater, there was at least one incident, I think actually 2, where in the dark of night, people went down and cut the lines of the boat to set it adrift because they didn't want the boat. They didn't want the boat in their community. And in the early days of the environmental movement, despite the fact, at least in the Hudson Valley, despite the fact that we had these brand new laws, there was a substantial part of the population that considered people like myself, who were active environmentalists, to be communist troublemakers, outside agitators. It was not a heroic venture back then at all.
The hard hat Archie Bunker crowd. And we're going to pause right here, get this commercial in, and pick it right back up. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer. We have John Cronin, professor at the Blue Co Lab at Pace University. We are talking some of the deep history, but some of the most significant history with regards to the environmental movement, and that is the Clean Water Act. And John has been one of the long, as I say, sung heroes. I can't say unsung, but long sung heroes whose life ended up, on as I say, on a hunch and a hook by Pete Seeger, roped into probably one of the most significant activists and leaders in water protection in our country and around the globe. We, as I say, if folks know what happens between the breaks and commercials, and they would say, why didn't you capture that? And one of the points I was bringing up was how, at that time, the TV shows, Joe the Hard Hat, was the movie, and Archie Bunker, All in the Crowd, the use of the angry working class, semi-literate poor guy against, young activists and those who are fighting civil rights. And one of the points I brought up, I said, it's kind of interesting that how they are using that as the foundational format and playbook to go against environmental, as I say, against climate change, civil rights, human rights, and women's rights. Isn't it ironic? And and you're seeing this cycle once again, where hard science and evidence calls for collective action. Corporations leverage the blue collar, the working class, the semi-literate, to push back against action that we need to take to save humanity.
American social history is, it's like you said, rinse and repeat. Stoke the fear, stoke the fear of change, fear of the disruptive, fear of the new, fear of challenging old values that got us into trouble because people are comfortable with them. And it's fear, so much of what happened against, the movements against the civil rights movement was about stoking white fear. And it's the same now. And our former president was an expert at it. And
second generation. His dad was out there with the Klan and the America First movement, right?
Yeah. And but I always remind everybody that President Trump lost the popular vote, lost re-election, messed up the Republicans badly in the midterms. He's already a 3-time loser. By if you do the electoral college votes back when he was first elected, something like between 10 and 15,000 popular votes distributed differently would have given the presidency to Clinton. There was nothing decisive about that.
No, he never won.
I like to remind. What's that?
I said the point. The empirical fact is that mathematically, the popular, he never won.
That's exactly right. And we have to, and it's important to remind ourselves of that. That he's a media star who keeps on losing.
Yeah.
But we've had close elections before.
I want to get back to the winning, and brother, you were part of that winning movement, and tell us about when you stepped in, because you're one with the founders of Riverkeeper, or was Riverkeeper up and running when you stepped into that? How did you transition from Clearwater to the Riverkeeper? Well,
there was a long path there, so and I won't belabor it too much, but I went from Clearwater to a group called the Center for the Hudson River Valley, which merged with Scenic Hudson. Then I was hired away by Congressman Hamilton Fish. And I resigned from Congressman Hamilton Fish when he became a right to life advocate. And then Assemblyman Maurice Hinchey, who was the chairman of the Assembly Environmental Conservation Committee, hired me, and I was on that staff. And then I quit that to be a commercial fisherman.
That's correct.
And then after about 3 seasons of that, I decided there were easier ways to go broke. And what happened was the Hudson River Fishermen's Association offered me the Riverkeeper job, which they had tried back in the mid 70s, and I was very close to the original Riverkeeper, but they couldn't raise the money. And then they had a successful lawsuit and had some money in their pocket and decided to start it again. And then they asked me to do it because I had experience on the river, I had political experience, I had investigated polluters while I worked for Clearwater, and I was lucky enough to be offered the job. And I started that in 1983 and did it for 17 years. And we bagged dozens and dozens of polluters, mostly under the Clean Water Act, which has a unique provision, Section 505, that says you can prosecute a polluter as if you're the Attorney General of the United States if they're violating the law. And we used that. We used it constantly with mostly law students as our attorneys.
And that's really powerful, because that comes in the way, because 1977 we have the act, but 1981 there were some major changes in the act, and you within a couple of years stepping onto Riverkeeper are now boots on the ground with your knowledge of and organizing, mobilizing, and activism. You were at the forefront of some of the most significant action that led to a Hudson River that is cleaner than it ever was, but also foundational laws and policies and actions that actually impacted water and water protection nationwide. I always had this question in the back of my mind, and I said, I got to ask John, the R. Ian Fisher, your boat.
R. Ian Fletcher, the Riverkeeper boat, yeah.
That came under your watch. Can you tell us about Ian Fletcher and what he meant as a scientist and his research with regard to your work and your activism?
There are a lot of unsung heroes in the environmental movement, and particularly in the Hudson River environmental movement. And R. Ian Fletcher, Dr. Fletcher, who's a good friend of mine, was one of them. He was brilliant. He shined the light on the fish kills at Indian Point nuclear plants in a way that nobody ever had before. He actually estimated the numbers, and he demonstrated how their technology did kill fish when Con Ed and the state of New York, which ran number 3, both said they weren't really killing fish. And he said, well, not only are you killing fish, you're killing them in the tens of millions a year. And then he designed he designed equipment to save a significant number of fish. He was also the brilliant scientist who uncovered the Army Corps of Engineers fraud for the Westway Highway that was going to fill in the Hudson River on the west side of Manhattan.
Really?
Ian did the research that discovered that was a wintering habitat for striped bass, and that the Army Corps of Engineers consultants lied and said the striped bass were distributed evenly between New York and New Jersey across the river. And Ian did the dirty work of finding out that actually they were all concentrated right in that area where the highway was going to be built. And Judge Grisey, who was the federal judge, said in court about the Army Corps of Engineers consultants, "I've heard perjury in my court before, and I'm hearing it now."
Wow.
And our Ian Fletcher is the man who prevented Westway. I mean, we had lawyers who did it in the federal court, but if it were not for our Ian Fletcher, we'd have a major highway instead of improvements in mass transit, and we would have buried the striped bass fishing grounds on the west side of Manhattan. And that park that's there now, the West Side Park, that Hudson River Park, that would not be there. That would not be there. That whole park should be named after Ian Fletcher, as far as I'm concerned. He was a brilliant man. And so when we got that boat, which was a gift from a lobster company in Connecticut, we decided we had to name it after him.
No, and it's a fitting tribute, but also it's a blessing. Like I said, that's why shows like this are important, because it's that unsung history within the environmental movement and the impact. Because one of the immediate thing is, there are many subsistence fishermen and anglers who relied upon shad, herring, and striped bass. Those are what I call the big protein sources of the Black and Hispanic community of that day. Right. And I remember as a kid, in fact, you could tell when the Indian Point was discharging, because when we were down there swimming and recreating in the Hudson River, you would see all the hundreds of fish as far as you could see just floating right by you. And we would just push them out of the way and just swim, like it was nobody's business, man.
Yeah, and then what Con Ed did is it devised a system where all those dead fish would be collected in a pit instead of going out into the river. And and a lot of people got the ugly job of counting those fish in the pit and getting rid of them and sending them to a dump, which the Hudson River Fishermen's Association discovered. And so it's just another example. Citizen action on the ground, on the water. That's what built the Hudson River environmental movement.
We got to get this last commercial in, and we'll be right back at the top. Sunday morning, our final segment on here on News, Views, and Interviews. We are, again, a wealth of knowledge. And John, let me tell you something. We could not do it all in one show, so we're definitely going to have you back. So I'm just going to put that out there, brother, and let you know, by the way, anything that's happening, that's coming up, I want you definitely keep us in mind as part of your media contacts and outreach of action that's going on in the environment, water protection. Even when there's something that needs to be dropped, if we have a Michael Moore event.
I'm happy to come back. Just have your email, call my email.
Excellent, we'll do. Another quick here, I gotta lift up real quick, and because I want to talk about what's next and action to current to date. Richard Brodsky, Hudson River PCBs.
Oh, Richard. Oh my gosh.
One of my fondest memories of you, me, and him doing one of your classes down there at Pace University.
That's right. We did the mock legislative hearing together with you and Richard. We could do a whole show with Richard Brodsky's stories. God bless him.
He's alive, man. He was alive. By the way, he was the one that convened the hearing on the Hudson River PCBs with Browner. And while everybody was arguing about the science, even our allies at Scenic Hudson and other places were getting into the measurement of what they could load. And when they gave it my turn to speak, I did the old Clinton, said, listen, man, it's the people, stupid. People are eating the fish. It's just that simple. And Secretary Browner's face dropped when I dropped that, and she was listening. She goes, they asked me to repeat it again. And I laid into the story of my family Me being second generation, my mom, childbearing years, my younger sister, when she was pregnant and kids in utero, I said it was nothing. Then and even now to see pregnant women. In fact, I said we have a lot of Eastern European people who eat carp, and
Oh yeah.
to this day, they get the fattest, largest fish at the Hudson produce, which is massive carp. And I gave that testimony, man. And ever since then, Richard Brodsky, he lit up because it gave him the weapon of the people and
Yeah.
stripped it away from just GE arguing about the science and what they were permitted to do under the law and under the science, and reduced it to the human right of clean food and clean water.
And yeah, and the human right, the human right to clean water, the human right to food, the human right to work. I mean,
Right.
commercial fishermen who had been were a couple hundred years of generations of commercial fishermen lost their jobs, and the industry is now gone, and
Yeah.
nobody's ever paid a reparation for it.
Well, not only
And the
that,
state,
we
and the
talk
state,
about
the state was complicit.
It's a weakness in the current Natural Damages Act because they are not looking at the culture, custom, and heritage dependencies upon the river that you can't really put a price on.
Right.
And the cultures, listen, the angler culture where a father, grandfather, mom, granddaughter take that generation down to the Hudson, and it was the passing of culture. You not only fish, that was where you had the conversation. That was where all the guys, my dad and them, talking about yesterday at a particular battle in World War II, or his other fellow vets talking about the Korean War. It was a place where you got knowledge, but it was like a rite of passage place. And once they got into, what happened and the impact, as we realized how contempt, you had to really seriously issue no-eat orders, and it literally destroyed an industry and it destroyed a way of life.
And and those of you who are listening, I want you to you should imagine that here in the third week of April, for a couple of hundred years, any available space on the Hudson River shoreline had nets stretched out to dry until the next high tide. Hundreds of people were employed, and during the Depression, it was a safe economic safety net. The federal government actually drafted people to go out and fish commercially for the food and for the jobs. And that safety net is gone, and that culture is gone, and it's you can't. It's too late to bring it back, but it could be taught. It could be taught, and I hope somebody thinks to do it. I was lucky enough to learn the skills myself.
I pray that as part of the Natural Resources Damages Act settlement that they recognize the impact, especially upon frontline communities, because they're getting a double whammy: the loss of the fishing culture and heritage within these Hudson River communities, going from Troy all the way down to New York City, but also now they're also facing the threats and impacts of climate change. So, what is the state of American drinking water right now? Where are we going?
So the state of American water generally. Let me just throw out some statistics to you. Under the Clean Water Act, we started talking about this. By 1985, the Clean Water Act was supposed to eliminate the discharge of pollutants into the nation's waters. As of right now, over 330,000 facilities still have permits to discharge into the nation's waters, despite the 1985 goal to eliminate them. Almost 5,000 water bodies have fish advisories in the United States. 17 million lake acres and over 1 million river miles have fish advisories. So we talk about the Hudson River. This is spread out all over the country. 42% of the nation's lake acreage and 36% of the nation's total river miles are the subject of fish health advisories.
Wow,
that's just unacceptable in the 21st century. And then as for drinking water, it is now accepted that contaminated drinking water is endemic in the United States. There's almost 20 million illnesses a year just from pathogens in drinking water in the United States. That's an extraordinary number, and people are dying as well as getting ill. And here's the thing that we can solve. And right now, the Environmental Protection Agency has proposed regulations out that will not solve it. People have a right to know what's in their water before they drink the water. Anybody who knows labor law, anybody who knows health law, anybody who knows food law knows what right to know means. It means that you have a right to information before that endangers you. You do not have that right to drink in with drinking water, even though EPA says you do. As a matter of fact, if there was an emergency in your drinking water, what your drinking water supplier is allowed to do is issue a news release, put up posters on telephone poles, and make radio announcements. There's no requirement they inform you by cell phone. And because of that, millions and millions of people are getting ill. We should have the right to know, if not immediately, as soon as absolutely possible, what is in our water. And that right to know isn't guaranteed. And here's the thing, and here's a bad turn that this is all taking. The bad turn this is all taking is that we're being told we should purchase water filters. We're being told we should purchase home tests. What segment of our population is least likely to invest their money over and over and over again in water filters and water tests?
Listen, we know the poor, Black, white, Indigenous, and Asian Americans, but more importantly, it's even deeper than that, John, because we talk about public health crisis. We're talking about women and women of childbearing age and children
Yes.
being poisoned.
Yes.
And
Yes.
And part of the other side of, we talk about the dirty politics and the corporate politics, is that they know that to engage in fixing this, they have to reverse some of the tax breaks that they've given corporations so that they can actually invest in the science and invest in the systems and invest in actually cleaning things up. The sad part, we are the nation, the world's largest and wealthiest nation, and yet we do the least investment in protecting our human beings from a dirty environment. We believe in clean water, clean air, and clean soil, but it is a human right. These things are essential just to our vitality and health.
And so here's what else they could be investing in, because they could be investing in a new industry that is not growing fast enough, which is to innovate real-time monitoring of water, innovate information technology so we're warned about our water. That's what Blue Collab is doing. That's what all these monitors you see behind me are, real-time monitoring of water. Mm-hmm. That should be part of New York State's innovation economy. It should be part of the United States innovation economy, and it's not.
How can people get a hold or get information? Is there a website? Is there a phone number? How people watching the show, can get a hold and get access to information? What's the best website, my brother?
Well, you could start with our website, which is bluecollab.pace.edu. And that will take you to our website, bluecollab.pace.edu. And if you look up on the top on the menu and click on Right to Know Water, you'll see we have a 26 student and faculty team here, and you'll see a 6-member team of women who have started the Right to Know H2O team, and they're going to be very active at the global, federal, and state level with the United Nations, the federal government, and New York State. Right to Know H2O. We have a right to know what's in our water if we're going to protect our health.
Well, brother, it's always good connecting with you. As always, I will always meet you in the field of struggle and direct action. I will also be at COP28. Maybe I hope to see you there. But, the revolution never stops. It never ceases. It's just, I call it the evolution, because it's just always ongoing. And it's always those of us who stand for humanity and the planet versus those who feel they can privatize, corporatize, pocket, get wealthy at our expense. Brother John Cronin, thank you for your time, and we are signing off.
Thank you.